Hi there, I'm Paul, and this is another of my videos about PowerApps. And in this video we're going to have a look at capturing an image within PowerApps and then uploading that image as a file into a SharePoint library. So I've done a previous video on capturing images and sending them to SQL Server or Azure SQL DB, but this time we're going to look specifically at SharePoint instead. Now, it's a little bit awkward doing it in SharePoint because when we capture the image in PowerApps, it's not in the right format to be loaded directly into the SharePoint Document Library. So we're going to show you here the little trick that you have to perform to get the data into the right order. And just as a spoiler, so anybody watching this knows straight away whether this video is for them or not, this is going to be the method that uses Flow to perform that manipulation on the file so that it can be loaded into the SharePoint Document Library. So I'm going to take you through the whole process. I'm going to talk fairly quickly. It is a video, so you can pause or rewind if I'm going too quick. So let's get started. So on my screen at the moment I've got my SharePoint team library, so I'm just going to quickly set up a document library. So what we're going to do is we're going to imagine that we're doing an application for bank deposits. So we're going to ask someone to deposit money in the bank for us and to take an image of that deposit using their mobile phone to enter a little bit of information about it. And then what we're going to do is we're going to load the image and the data that we've captured into the document library. So the image is going to come in, and then the data that's been captured is going to appear in the metadata columns within that document library. So here we go. Let's create our bank deposit library. And now I'm going to add some extra columns that we're going to need to be filled in. So they've put in the bank deposit for us, and we're going to need to know what the amount is. So we're going to have a number field, which I'm going to call deposit amount. And we're going to want a deposit date. So obviously that's going to be a date field. Deposit date. And we'll have one more. We'll imagine that these bank deposits are for a rental business, and we want the name of the tenant in there as well. Okay, so now we've got our document library with our columns set up. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch into PowerApps, and I'm going to create a Power App from that document library. So we're going to let PowerApps do most of the work for us. So I'll select the phone layout. So now what I've got to do is to put in the URL of the team site, which contains the library. So we pop that in there. Daisy. Try that one more time. Okay, there we go. And then we have got to enter the name of our library. So we've selected pasted in the name of the team site or the containing site, subsite, and now we're going to put in the library name, bank deposit, select it, connect to it, and now we're going to let SharePoint do its magic, and that's going to build for us the typical 3-screen app. So screen 1 is going to be a browse screen showing us a list of all of the files within our document library, and then we're going to have, there it is, there's the browse screen. Then we're going to have a detail screen where we can see the information, all the information for an individual file that we select, and then an edit screen where we can change information. Now what I'm going to do first on here is I'm going to add a new screen, and this is going to be the screen which we're going to use for capturing the image, the picture of the bank deposit, which we're going to upload. So I'm going to insert new screen. I'm going to choose a form screen just so that I get the title bar and the tick and the cross on there, but I don't actually want the form in there because this is going to be for, as I say, taking the picture. So I'm going to add a control now, so I'm going to add the camera control. Now there are two similar controls, the camera control and the add picture control. The add picture control is better, or some would argue it's better, because if you're using a mobile device, then you use the mobile device's I think native camera software, so you may be getting extra options that you don't get when you choose camera from here. But I'm going to choose camera because this is how we need to do it to make it work, to be able to send the image through to SharePoint. If we use the add picture, it comes through in a different format yet again, and that one is a format that I at least don't know how to convert into the SharePoint library. So let's go with camera for right now. So there we've got our camera set up. We've got a lovely image there of the speaker sitting behind my laptop. And what we're going to do then is we're going to then add a second control, which is going to be a image control. And I'm doing this because what we will do is we will make it so that when we take a picture using the camera, we can then see what that picture looks like. I'm not going to worry too much in this demonstration about positioning things nicely. That's not really terribly relevant. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to say, right, when I tap on this camera image, take a photo. So let's do that now. So that's going to be the onSelect property. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to store the image in a collection. It's only going to have one image at a time, so when we press the button we're going to use the clear collect command to clear out any previous picture and load our new picture in. Okay, so I'm going to give my collection a name, which I'm just going to call Col Photo, and my camera control is called Camera 1 because I haven't renamed anything. Of course you should rename things to sensible naming convention, but we're saving time here. So camera1.photo. So let's do that. Yep. And now what we'll do is we'll click on the image to trigger that, make sure that's working. So I'm going to go into View and Collections. So there we are. So because I clicked on the camera control, the onSelect event fired, and what it did was it captured the picture and it put the picture in a column which is called URL. So we'll keep that in mind for later. Okay, so I want to show down here the picture that we have just taken. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show what is in that collection that we just made. So here we go. We are going to say the image is, now a collection can have multiple items in it, so I'm going to say I want the first item from Col Photo, and Col Photo has only got one column in it, but I'm still going to have to specify it. It's the URL column. So there we are. So when I take a picture, that's going to appear down here. If I move my screen a little bit just to prove that this is happening, click on the camera and boom, you can see there that once we've taken an image, that image is being stored. So that's great. So our user can now take a picture of the bank deposit, check that the picture looks legible, and then what we will do is we will have an extra button on here which we will use for proceeding to the next part of the process, which is to add in some information about that image and then click to save it. So I could call this something like take photo, and we could remove the tick, or at least we'll take out the event information behind it, so we haven't got that warning triangle anymore. Instead of pressing the button, we could use the tick. I'll tell you what, we'll actually do that because we've already got a tick on here, so we'll use the tick to take us through to the next screen. So the next screen is going to be the one where we add our information, so we're going to add a tenant, a deposit amount, and a deposit date. And so what we want to use for that is a form. So we've already got a form that has been created for us. I'm going to duplicate that. So the existing one that has been created for us by PowerApps, we'll keep that in case we want to go in later and modify existing data. So that will be our form for editing existing data. And I'm going to just copy this, duplicate this now, and set this up as a screen for entering new data. So let's go in and do that. So I'm going to duplicate screen. We are going to then perhaps call this new screen. Okay, now what I should have done but didn't because I'm rushing a little bit is on the edit screen I should have taken out the fields that we don't need and then duplicated it. So now if I were to want to remove things like the modified and the modified by, I've got to do it twice, but never mind, we're only going to work on the new screen for this one. So this is going to be for our new bank deposit, and let's just get rid of the fields we don't want. We don't use title, modified or modified by. We do use the deposit amount, the deposit date, and the tenant, and then I can get rid of these other ones. Okay, so that's the information that we want to capture. I think what I'm going to do is I am going to also show the image on here, so I can just do a straight copy of my image control and paste it here. So that's kept the the formula that determines what is displayed in there. Okay, so there we are. Obviously I could go in and I could start setting things like default values and stuff in here. Again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to do any of that. We're just going to concentrate on this whole business of taking a picture, putting in the data, and then getting that into the SharePoint Document Library. So at this point, this is where we now have to jump out of PowerApps, because remember, we can't send the image directly to our document library because it's in the wrong format. We've got to use an intermediary step, and we're going to use Flow for that. So PowerApps, we're going to send the image and the associated data to Flow. Then we're going to do some manipulation in Flow to get the image into the right format, and then Flow is going to push the image into the document library. So let's jump into Flow now, and I'm just going to create a flow from blank. So if you're able to use PowerApps, you should be able to use Flow as well. It's all part of the Office 365 package. I mean, check it first just in case your corporate environment have allowed you to use PowerApps but have disabled Flow for some reason. But you know, you've got the license and everything to it. So in most cases, I think if you've got PowerApps, you should have Flow as well. If you haven't used Flow, Flow is something which just sort of sits on your Office 365 tenant the whole time, and it waits for events, for triggers, and then when one of those triggers fires, it can go off and it can do this custom processing that you set up for it. So it can do all sorts of things like respond to when you receive an email, or when a new item is put in a document library, and in this case, when we're sending something to it from PowerApps. It can also run on a recurring schedule, all sorts of different triggers. So within Flow, you'll see things are separated into triggers and actions. And for this, we are going to be triggering our event from PowerApps. So I'm going to do a little search on PowerApps and look for PowerApps triggers, and there's only one. So that makes it easy. So I'm going to select my PowerApp trigger. There it is. And it says we don't need to do anything else about this step. So let's click the New Step button. Add an action. And our action is going to be that we want to create a file in SharePoint Document Library. So SharePoint create file. There we go. Now if this all seems a little bit esoteric to you at the moment, don't worry, just follow through this once and I think you will then get the picture. It's difficult to explain everything up front and then do it, so I'll explain it as we go along, and then hopefully things will be a little bit clearer. So I've said, look, when I trigger this flow in PowerApps, and we'll show you how to do that in a moment in PowerApps, but when this is triggered, then create a file, and we have to say where the file is going to go. So let's again pick up our URL for our site or subsite. Flow is fantastic in terms of what it can do, but the user interface can be a bit painful. So you'll see when you click in here, it's not giving me my full list of all my sites. Not quite sure why that is. If I try and click just in the box here and paste, then I tend to get an error. But if I choose enter custom value and then paste, then it's happy. Okay, so make sure on that drop down you choose enter custom value and then put in your URL. Now that we've done that, it should pick up our folder paths from this site. So here is our bank deposit, so it did pick that up. Now, a word of caution here: if you're using a picture library instead of a document library, then it doesn't get listed down here, okay, which is frustrating. Now you can put in the name of the picture library just by typing it and entering it, but you have to leave off that forward slash. So if it's a picture library, don't put in the forward slash, just type in the name of the picture library. So it's a nasty UI foible there. Certainly caught me out when I was trying to use it with a picture library initially. Okay, so now what do we want to name the file? Well, what we'll do is we will get that information from PowerApps. So I'm going to choose this option here, ask in PowerApps. Okay, so this has now created a variable called create file. So that's based on the name of this step here, create file, and then file name, because that's the information that we want to go and get. So another word of warning about the Flow interface: you can rename these steps, or at least most of them, with this rename, but make sure you do that before you add anything in here, because once you've added something in here, that variable that we've created called create file file name, you can't get rid of it, or at least I've never found a way of getting rid of it. So if you want to rename one of these steps, rename the step first, then start filling these things in. Otherwise, you'll end up with variables that are not used, and when we trigger this flow from PowerApps will still be asking you to fill in those unused variables. So a word of warning there. So now again, I'm going to say I want to ask for this in PowerApps. So there I've got my two variables, which is great. So although we don't directly modify this PowerApps step, by choosing this ask in PowerApps, it's kind of setting this up in the background so that when we connect this flow to PowerApps, PowerApps will ask us to fill in this information. We'll see that a little bit later. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that our file content, when it comes in from PowerApps, is going to be in the wrong format. So this flow is actually going to fail because my content is in the wrong format, but I still need to do this in the sequence that I'm showing you now. So I'm going to add a new step between my PowerApps trigger and my create file action, and this is going to modify the file that has come in from PowerApps, and it's going to change its change the format of the data to something that's compatible with SharePoint. So I'm going to use a compose action. So a compose action in Flow is something that just lets you modify some data or create a variable or do something of that nature. So I'm now going to go into my inputs, and we're now going to get slightly more complicated again. So I've got a whole set of expressions that I can use to modify data. So I'm going to choose the expression first of all, and the expression I want is data URI to binary. Now, I don't know why it's in PowerApps referred to as URL, as you saw when we went into the collection, but in Flow it's referred to as URI. Very confusing, but they seem to be the same thing. So I'm going to choose this data URI to binary command, and I'm going to put in an open bracket. Okay, and it's put in an open bracket and a closed bracket. You can't see it because it's brought up a little tooltip there. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill in what's inside that bracket by going to my dynamic content and choosing my create file content variable. So remember, this is going to be the thing that PowerApps asks for. This is where we're going to give it the image to load. So there we are. That's filled that in for me. So I'm going to click the OK button on there. So now I've got a step which is going to convert from URI to binary my create file content information. So now I need to change this file content part of the create file step. This is the file as it has come in from PowerApps. What I want to do is to take the output of this compose step. So I'm going to get rid of that, and I'm going to take the output from my compose step. Now, I haven't named these steps as I've gone through. I have mentioned that it's a good idea to do that and to make sure absolutely that you do that before you add anything to those actions. Otherwise you end up with these sort of orphaned variables that you still get asked about in PowerApps. If you've got a flow of any great length, you might have several compose statements in there, and they'll end up being called things like compose, compose 1, compose 2. And you can see here you need to reference sometimes the output of these actions and these steps and use them elsewhere. And if you haven't bothered to give things a sensible name, then it gets very difficult if you've got a long flow to figure out which is the right thing to put in each place. Right, now this flow will take a file name and the file as we specify in PowerApps, and this will load it into SharePoint for us. So we're almost there. If we don't want any additional metadata, that's fine. We don't have to do any other steps. But in this case, we do want to do, or we do want to add some additional information. So remember, we're going to ask about the deposit amount, the deposit date, and the tenant. So I'm going to add a new step. And in this step, this is going to be a SharePoint, and I believe it's called update file. So let's just have a look through the list. update file properties. That's the one we want. So now it's going to ask us, okay, you want to update a file, so where is that file? So again, I'm just going to put in my site address, and remember, I'm going to choose enter custom value and then enter it because of the oddness of the Flow user interface. I'm going to put in my bank deposit and then an ID. So I've got to tell it what I want to alter. So this step here has created the file. The file is already in there, and now I'm saying, well, I want to update the properties of one of the files. So I need to specify which file is the one that I want to change. So what I can do here for this ID now is I can look at my dynamic content and I can say, right, I want to take something from the create file step. So the create file step, in addition to taking these arguments and creating the file, will give me an output. It will tell me the ID that was created, or the ID of the file that was created. So in here I can say, give me the item ID. Or sorry, in here I can say, take the item ID from the create file step and use that. So now, because I've specified my site and my library name, the system flow has automatically gone and checked in SharePoint and figured out what columns exist in my SharePoint library there. And I'm not worried about the title. We're not going to bother using that particular field. But the deposit amount, deposit date, and the tenant we want, and we are going to have to get that information from PowerApps. So we're going to use the ask in PowerApps step here. Now I haven't added any output yet, so let me do a name change on here, and you'll see how that looks in PowerApps in a moment. So I'm going to call this, we'll give this a more descriptive name, and we will call it add bank deposit detail, and I'm going to say ask for that in PowerApps, and do you see here it says add bank deposit detail underscore deposit amount, and the deposit date we're going to ask for in PowerApps, and the tenant we're going to ask for in PowerApps. There we are. So that's our flow created. So quick overview. The first step is the trigger, and we'll see in a moment how we can use PowerApps to start this trigger off, to fire this trigger. We're going to ask for the file name, the file content, and our deposit amount, deposit date, and tenant in this step. So this step is picking up the information from later steps and is going to present it to PowerApps. So we're doing our compose to get our data in the right format for SharePoint. We're then going to load the file into SharePoint, and we're going to pick up the ID of the file we've just loaded in, and then we're going to update the properties for that row, and we're going to add in our deposit amount and our deposit dates and our tenants and so on. Okay, so finally I'm going to give this a name, so I'm going to call it BDT Bank Deposit. Now you can see the name of one where I was practicing earlier before doing the video. So create flow, and that should just take it a few seconds. So there we are, your flow was created. So I can click done now, and we'll see here is our flow, and the run history says, well, it's never run, which is true. So now we're going to run it from PowerApps. So back into PowerApps again, and just so that on this edit form, oh okay, no, it's clear enough which card is which, I think. Oh no, okay. So I'm going to just quickly rename these so that they're easier to determine which one is which, because in a moment I'm going to have to enter them into the formula bar, and if I haven't named them then it becomes a bit of a guessing game which one is which. So I'm going to use DCB for data card value, and this one is the deposit amount, and then in this one, this is the deposit date, DCV in front of it, and then we're going to have the tenant DCV tenant. There we go. Okay, and in 1 second you're going to see why that is important. So let's go up to our tick. So we're going to, when the tick is clicked, take the image, take our metadata, push it into the flow, and then the flow is going to push it into SharePoint. So I don't want to do any form submitting, so I'm going to take that out. I'm still using a form because I want to make sure that I can clear all of the data out between each deposit being created. And so if it's a form, then later on I can use the form new command, and so it will just put everything back to blank or whatever the default is. Okay, so now when we click the tick, this is where we want to fire off this flow. So how do we do that? Make sure you're on the onSelect property for the tick. Go into Action, and there we've got a little button for flows, and when we click that, PowerApps is going to go off and it's going to look for the flows that we have set up, and there it is. It's found our PDT bank deposit flow, so I'm going to select that flow. Now it's saying adding, so it's doing a little bit of plumbing in the background, and here we are. It's going to now allow me to use PDT bank deposit, that was the name of our flow, .run, and then look, here are all of those arguments that we created in flow, and they're the name of the step and then the name of the thing that needs to be added. So our file name, right, well, for this test run I'm just going to call this test1.gpg, and then our file content, so that's in our collection, remember, so we can say colphoto, but also remember that a collection can have multiple items in it, so we want the first from colphoto, and we want the calls it URL when it's in PowerApps and URI when it's in flow. And just in case I didn't make it clear at the beginning, you need to put your picture into a collection to get it into that URL format. So if you try and take the picture directly from the camera and use camera1.photo and upload it through Flow, I don't think that will work because it uses yet another format again. Okay, so now we want to say what our deposit amount is, so that's going to be DCV deposit amount. And now we want our deposit date, DCV deposit date. So now you can see why I took the time to rename these items to make it clear what we're putting into this formula here. And now we want the DCV tenant. Fantastic. That's it, believe it or not. So let's give it a try. So I'm going to put in a deposit amount of $999. I'm going to put in a deposit date. We'll make it today's date. There we go. And then we'll put in a tenant name, and we'll call this one Fred. So we've got our metadata filled in, we've got our image. Let's click on the tick and see what happens. I'm getting a little red thing. Why am I getting a red thing? Tell me what's gone wrong. Oh, okay, of course I'm always forgetting to do this. I need to put in the text that's in that. And this one, I guess, is probably going to be text as well. Does it also have a problem with date? Let's just see. Yeah, I got a problem with date too. So sorry, forgotten a step here. Our data type is numeric for our deposit amount, and our SharePoint library of course knows that, so it's told Flow, and Flow has told PowerApps. So it knows what sort of data it should be expecting, and so we've got to pass it the correct data types for it to work. So that seems to be a little bit happier. Now let's give it a try. Let's just give this a go. Yay, so there we are. So easy when you know how. Difficult when you have a short memory like me and you can't remember. So yeah, so we've got to use the value command and make sure we've specified the text property for these fields. We're okay with the date because we can just use the selected date property. Okay, so we had a second there of the thing processing, so let's just see what's happened now in Flow. I'm going to refresh this, and lovely, okay, it's told me that my last run succeeded, and so now I'm going to go into my library and I'm going to refresh my library, and hopefully we're going to see, yes, there it is. So we've got our test1 JPG file which arrived about a minute ago. We'll just have a click on that and we should see the image. There's the image, the exciting image of the speaker sitting behind my laptop, but we haven't got the deposit amount or the tenant. Interesting. Okay, let me investigate that for a second. That's not an exciting thing for you to watch, so I'm going to investigate and then I'm going to come back when I've figured out where I've missed a step. Okay, so sorry about that. Here we are. We can see what I've done wrong here. I just did another test, by the way, but we can see what I've done wrong here. When I created my SharePoint library, I have specified tenant as being a number instead of a line of text. So let's quickly fix that now. So jump into the library settings and we will go into tenant. No, that's not what I've done wrong. Curiouser and curiouser. Okay, sorry again. I have found what the problem was this time. So when I've duplicated this screen, the edit mode, the default mode of the form has remained in edit. Because I've been working just in the designer and I haven't yet put a button on that opens the form and opens it in new mode, it's picking up this default mode from here. So we need to be in the new mode, and when we do that then we shouldn't actually need to put in all these things that I put in just a moment ago. I think when we're in new mode it behaves a little bit differently, and let's try again putting in our amount 101 tenant bill, and I'm just manually changing these file names at the moment. We'll look at some solutions for putting in a file name in a second, but let's just check that this is finally running properly. So to recap, we've got to make sure that our form is in new mode for this to work correctly. So click on here, and now we haven't got any errors. We had a little set of processing lines appear. Okay, so this is test 5. I'm going to go into my library. I'm going to refresh my library, and let's see if test 5 comes in. There it is, with a deposit amount of 101 and a tenant of Bill. No deposit date at the moment, so that's probably the case where we do actually need to here specify that it is the selected date for a date field. So let's do another one. Let's make this 202, and we'll have our tenant as Jane this time, and we'll hit the button and we will check what's come through to our library. Of course I didn't actually enter a deposit date, did I? Although it defaulted to today. Let's try that again. Okay. Deposit date. Did I set deposit date up as a date field? Bear with me. Okay, back again. So third time lucky, or was it the fourth or the fifth? So what we need to do is, if it's a date, then we've got to put the dot selected date on the end to make sure that that's coming through in the correct format. So that now is going to bring in all of our data. I'm going to change the file name again to test6. We don't currently have a test6 in our SharePoint library. So here we are, amount, let's make it a new amount, let's make this 999. We'll change the date to show that the date is now working properly, just any date will do. And we'll hit the tick, and off it runs, and we'll be able to see in here that it ran successfully, and we'll have a little look and check that it has come into our library. So here we are, test 6 999, and finally with the deposit date as well as the tenant information in there. So we have achieved what we were trying to achieve. Sorry for the painful bit at the end there. We are managing to get our images and their associated metadata from PowerApps into our SharePoint library via Flow. So fantastic. A couple of quick words of caution. You're going to need some way of getting unique file names in here. So I've already got a test6 in my library. Let's show you. We've got a test6 in the library. If we load something else with test6 in it, so let's just change some of these details here. I'm going to make that 111. I'm going to make this the 13th, and we'll change the name, and we could have changed the image as well. So what is going to happen is we're going to send this information to Flow, okay, and it says call this thing test6, and what Flow is going to do, it's going to load test6 into the library, because there's a test6 there already, it's going to replace it. So let's just demonstrate that that is what happens. So our existing test6 belongs to Jane for the amount of 999. Our new test6 is the amount of 111 and Sally, and we're going to click the tick on there, and in just a brief second, there we are, it's changed it. So be careful about what you're going to do about these file names. So there are some tips online about how you can create random things. You could use some combination of the date. You can actually pull back the existing ID. So I believe on our form we could say bring in the oh sorry, we want to show the maximum ID, but we could show we could work out the maximum ID of the items already in our SharePoint library and then add one to that. But obviously you're going to have to be careful there if you've got multiple users. If you've got multiple people all using the system at the same time, then they might all try and put in the same file. So do make sure that you do something to ensure unique file names, otherwise you're going to find yourself overwriting data that was already there. Okay, well I think we're at the 45-minute or so mark now, so I'm going to call it a day there, but that's how you do it. So from PowerApps, images and associated metadata being loaded into a SharePoint document library or picture library via the magic of flow. Just keep in mind there are lots of fiddly little traps along the way that are designed to catch you out and drive you mad. I think I've probably come across most of those while I was trying to do this video, but best of luck trying to avoid discovering any more. Okay, I'm calling it a day there. Please leave your comments below. I really appreciate knowing if you found this useful, or if you haven't found it useful, tell me why and I'll try and do better the next time. Okay, thanks and goodbye.